California is about to spend billions of dollars to fix its most important water highway, the enormous aqueduct that carries life across the state to some 27 million people. And here is the strange, almost tragic thing about that money. It will work. The aqueduct will flow again at something closer to its full strength. But the fix will buy only about 11 years, a single decade of relief, and then the very same problem will come creeping back, because the billions being spent do not touch the real cause of the damage. They treat the symptom while the disease keeps spreading underground, silently, permanently, beneath the concrete. This is the story of the California aqueduct, the slow-motion catastrophe that is strangling it, why the most expensive repair in its history can only delay the reckoning rather than end it, and what this reveals about a mistake so deep that no amount of concrete and money can fully undo it. It is a story about sinking land, vanishing water, the false comfort of a fix that looks complete, and the hard limits of trying to engineer your way out of a problem you refuse to stop creating. To understand why this matters so much, you first have to understand what the California aqueduct actually is, because it is one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the entire United States. It is a vast concrete river built by human hands, stretching some 440 miles from the wet green north of California all the way down to the thirsty cities of the south. It begins near the Great Delta, where the state's rivers meet, and it carries their water down the spine of California through the immense farmland of the Central Valley, over mountains, and into the sprawling metropolis of Southern California, feeding Los Angeles, San Diego, and the millions of people and farms in between. Roughly 27 million Californians depend on it, along with a huge share of the agriculture that feeds not just the state, but much of the country. If this aqueduct were to fail completely, it would be a civilizational emergency of almost unimaginable scale. It is, quite literally, one of the arteries that keeps the most populous state in America alive. Now here's the crucial detail, the thing that makes the aqueduct so vulnerable, and it is a detail most people never think about. For much of its length, the aqueduct is not pumped. It moves its water the same way a river does, by gravity, flowing gently downhill along a precisely engineered slope. Engineers divide it into sections, called pools, and the water slides from one to the next along a carefully calculated descent, so gentle that the drop is measured in inches over miles. This is an elegant, efficient design because gravity is free and pumps are expensive, but it carries a hidden fragility. A gravity-fed channel depends entirely on the ground beneath it staying exactly where it is supposed to be. The whole system assumes that the land holds its shape, that the downhill slope remains intact, that the concrete stays level and true. And that single assumption, the assumption that the ground would stay put, is precisely the assumption that has turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Because in California's Central Valley, the ground is not staying put. It is sinking. In some places, it is sinking faster than almost anywhere else in the United States, and it has been sinking for the better part of a century. The technical name for this is subsidence, and the cause is something deceptively simple: the pumping of groundwater. Beneath the Central Valley lies a vast underground system of water-bearing sediment, layers of sand and gravel separated by layers of fine clay. For generations, farmers across this intensely productive region have drilled wells and pumped water from beneath the ground to irrigate their crops, especially in dry years when there is little water available from rivers or the aqueduct itself. And when you pump enough water out of that underground system, something irreversible happens. The clay layers, which had been held up by the pressure of the water within them, lose that support and compact, squeezing together like a sponge being wrung out. The ground above them sinks, and crucially, once those clay layers compress, they do not spring back. Even if the water returns, the land stays low. The sinking is, for all practical purposes, permanent. It helps to picture what is actually happening thousands of feet below the surface, because the physics of it explains why this damage can never simply be reversed. Deep underground, the aquifer system is not a single open pool of water like an underground lake. It is a dense sandwich of materials, coarse layers of sand and gravel that hold and transmit water easily, interleaved with much finer layers of clay and silt. Those fine clay layers are the key. When the aquifer is full, the water pressure inside these clay layers helps hold the tiny particles apart, keeping the whole structure puffed up like a saturated sponge. But when heavy pumping draws the water level down, the pressure inside those clay layers drops, and the weight of everything above begins to squeeze them. The delicate structure collapses, the particles pack tightly together, and the clay compresses to a fraction of its former thickness. Because clay drains and responds so slowly, this compaction can continue for years after the pumping, grinding downward long after the wells have gone quiet. And once those particles have packed together, they interlock permanently. You can refill the aquifer completely, and they will not loosen again. The storage space is gone forever, and so is the height of the land above. This is why experts describe most of the valley's subsidence as irreversible. It is not water that has been lost, but the very architecture of the ground itself. The numbers are staggering. In parts of the San Joaquin Valley, the land has dropped by 20 or even 30 feet over the past century. Along the aqueduct itself, some stretches have sunk by 10 or more feet since the channel was built. During intense droughts, when farmers pump the hardest because there is no other water, the sinking accelerates dramatically. In one recent multi-year drought, sections of the aqueduct dropped by nearly 3 feet in just a handful of years. Imagine that, a massive concrete channel, engineered to move water by the gentlest downhill slope, with the ground beneath it dropping by feet at a time in some places, while staying put in others. That uneven sinking is the heart of the disaster. Because it does not lower the whole aqueduct evenly, it creates dips and sags, low spots where the land has fallen the most, forming what engineers grimly call bowls of subsidence. Picture what that does to a channel that relies on a perfect downhill slope. Where the land sinks into a bowl, the aqueduct sags with it, creating a low belly in what was supposed to be a smooth, continuous descent. The water pools in that sag, and the smooth flow is choked, like a kink in a garden hose. These choke points strangle the aqueduct's capacity, throttling how much water can pass through. And the effect has been devastating. Along the most damaged segments, the aqueduct and the connected canals have already lost a huge fraction of their design capacity, in some places more than 40%. Nearly half the water that this vital artery was built to carry can no longer flow through parts of it, all because the ground has slumped beneath the concrete. To keep the water moving at all, operators have been forced into expensive workarounds, running the system harder, raising water levels dangerously close to the top of the channel walls, and shifting deliveries to less efficient times, all to squeeze water past the sinking sections. The consequences of that lost capacity radiate outward in ways that are easy to miss. The California aqueduct does its most important work in the wettest years, when there is a surge of water available in the north that needs to be captured and moved south quickly, either for immediate use or to be banked underground for the dry years to come. That ability to move a large pulse of water during the brief wet windows is one of the system's greatest strengths, a hedge against the state's violent swings between flood and drought. But a choked, subsided aqueduct cannot carry that surge. When the capacity is gone, the water the state most needs to grab and store during a wet year simply cannot get through the bottlenecks, and the opportunity slips away downstream and out to sea. In this way, subsidence does not just reduce how much water flows on an ordinary day, it quietly sabotages California's entire strategy for surviving a climate of deepening extremes, undermining the very flexibility that was supposed to carry the state through the hard years ahead. Every foot the land sinks makes the state a little less able to save itself in the good years for the bad ones. And here is the cruelest irony of the entire situation, the twist that makes this story so haunting. The California aqueduct was itself built, in part, to solve this very problem when engineers designed it in the 1960s. They already knew the valley was sinking from groundwater pumping. In fact, one of the great hopes for the aqueduct was that by delivering abundant surface water from the north, it would give farmers an alternative to pumping from underground. The dream was that the aqueduct's water would reduce the need to drain the aquifers, the sinking would slow and stop, and the valley would stabilize. The engineers even built extra height into the channel walls, a cushion they called freeboard, precisely to give the system room to keep working as the land settled, expecting the subsidence to gradually tail off once the surface water arrived. It was a reasonable, even hopeful plan. But it did not happen that way, instead of replacing groundwater pumping. The abundant new water helped fuel an explosion of agriculture, and in dry years, when the surface water dwindled, the pumping came roaring back, harder than ever. The cure was swallowed by the disease. The aqueduct, built to stop the sinking, is now, in a bitter twist, strangled by the very sinking it was meant to prevent. So now California faces an enormous bill to repair the damage. To restore the aqueduct's lost capacity, engineers must undertake a massive reconstruction, raising the concrete liners along the sunken stretches, rebuilding sagging sections, reworking check structures, and in some places, potentially adding pumps to lift water past the areas that can no longer carry it by gravity alone. The price tag for all of this is measured in the billions of dollars, a staggering sum that must be shared among the state, the federal government, and the local water agencies that depend on the deliveries. The engineering options on the table each come with their own painful trade-offs, which helps explain why the cost climbs so high. The most straightforward approach is to raise the concrete liner along the sunken reaches, essentially building the walls of the channel back up to recover the lost height and restore the freeboard that subsidence has eaten away. This works, but it is enormously expensive and must be repeated wherever the land has dropped. A more drastic option is to reconstruct entire segments, physically rebuilding the aqueduct's bed and slope to re-establish the gentle downhill grade that gravity requires. Another possibility is to abandon pure gravity in the worst hit stretches altogether and install pumping plants to lift the water up and over the sags, but this trades a one-time construction cost for a permanent, ongoing energy bill, adding to the enormous amount of electricity the system already consumes. Engineers have also weighed simply accepting lower operating capacity in the damaged sections and rerouting or rescheduling deliveries around them, a cheaper path that quietly surrenders some of the aqueduct's original promise. Every one of these choices is really a different way of answering the same grim question. How much are we willing to spend to fight a force that will not stop pushing back? And this is where we return to the heart of the matter, to the promise and the futility captured in that phrase, buys 11 years, then nothing. Because when California spends those billions and rebuilds the aqueduct to restore its capacity, it will indeed work. The water will flow more freely again. But the repair does absolutely nothing to stop the ground from continuing to sink. Think carefully about what that means. The billions being spent are aimed at the aqueduct, at the concrete and the channel and the liners. They are not aimed at the aquifer, at the pumping, at the underground compaction that is the actual cause of the problem. And as long as the groundwater overpumping continues, the land will keep sinking, the bowls of subsidence will keep deepening, and the freshly repaired aqueduct will begin losing its capacity all over again. The repair does not cure the disease, it merely resets the clock. It restores the lost height and slope, buying perhaps a decade or so of relief before the relentless, ongoing subsidence eats away those gains and the choke points return. You spend billions, you get roughly 11 years, and then, unless something fundamental has changed beneath the surface, you are right back where you started, staring at a sinking aqueduct and an even larger repair bill, only now with less money and less time than before. It is the infrastructure equivalent of bailing out a boat without ever patching the hole. This raises the obvious question: why not simply stop the overpumping and cure the disease at its root? And the answer reveals just how deep and difficult this problem truly is. California did pass a landmark law more than a decade ago designed to bring groundwater pumping into balance and end the chronic overdraft, but that law gives the region until around the year 2040 to actually achieve sustainability, and it pointedly does not pay for repairing the damage already done. Worse, even if all the excess pumping stopped tomorrow, the subsidence would not stop immediately. The compaction of those deep clay layers continues for years after the pressure changes, a slow, grinding settling that plays out long after the wells fall quiet. So there is no quick switch to flip. The valley is locked into more sinking regardless, and the full cure, if it comes at all, lies many years in the future. Water planners have modeled where this leads, and the projections are sobering. If the overpumping continues at anything like recent rates, the models show the aqueduct's capacity in the worst hit reaches continuing to erode over the next 2 decades. with potential losses in some scenarios climbing toward levels that would cripple deliveries. Some analyses warn that without decisive action, the reduction in capacity along the most damaged segments could grow from the roughly 40+% already lost toward the catastrophic range within about a decade. That is the shadow hanging over every repair. The engineers are not fixing a static problem, but racing against a moving one, rebuilding capacity that the ground is actively working to take away again. It is why the 11-year figure is so telling. It is not that the concrete wears out in 11 years. It is that the land, if left unchecked, will have sunk enough by then to swallow the improvement whole. There are also powerful forces pushing in the opposite direction, making the pumping stubbornly hard to reduce. In recent decades, farmers across the valley have shifted enormous acreage away from annual row crops, which can be left unplanted in dry years, toward permanent crops like almond, pistachio, and other orchards, along with vineyards. These trees and vines represent huge long-term investments, and unlike a field of vegetables, they cannot simply be fallowed when water runs short. They must be watered every single year to survive, drought or no drought. So when the dry years come and surface water shrinks, the pressure to pump groundwater is not just strong, it is existential for those farmers, who face losing orchards worth fortunes. This makes the pumping sticky, resistant to reduction precisely when the sinking accelerates. And climate change threatens to make it all worse, delivering more frequent and severe droughts, which means less surface water, which means still more desperate pumping, which means still more sinking. It is worth being fair here, because it would be easy to cast the farmers as villains, and that would be both unkind and inaccurate. The Central Valley is one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, growing a remarkable share of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables that feed the United States. The people pumping that groundwater are, in many cases, simply trying to keep their farms and their livelihoods alive through brutal dry spells, using the only water available to them. They did not set out to destroy the aqueduct. They are responding rationally to a system that, for a century, treated groundwater as a free and unlimited resource. The tragedy here is not one of villainy, but of a commons overused by many hands, each acting sensibly on its own, adding up to a catastrophe none of them wanted. And untangling it means asking whether some of that farmland must ultimately come out of production, a wrenching prospect for the communities and the food supply that depend on it. There are no easy heroes or villains, only a genuinely hard collision between food, water, money, and the physical limits of the land itself. There is even a further hidden cost, one that reaches into every Californian's life, whether they farm or not. The state water project that runs the aqueduct is the single largest consumer of electricity in all of California. Moving that much water requires staggering amounts of power, and when subsidence chokes the gravity flow, operators are forced to move water at less efficient times and in less efficient ways, driving up energy use and cost. A sinking aqueduct is not just a water problem, it is an energy problem, quietly raising costs and emissions across the state. The damage beneath the Central Valley ripples outward into electricity bills, into the power grid, into the broader effort to fight climate change, touching people who have never given a moment's thought to where their water comes from. A sage in a canal 100 miles from the nearest city ends up nudging up the cost and the carbon of keeping the lights on for everyone. So what is the real lesson of the California aqueduct and its 11-year repair? It is a lesson about the limits of engineering, about the difference between treating a symptom and curing a disease. California can, and probably will, spend the billions to raise the liners and restore the flow. And it should, because letting the aqueduct fail is unthinkable, and buying even a decade of reliability has real value for the millions who depend on it. But everyone involved understands, or ought to understand, that this is borrowed time. The concrete can be rebuilt, but the ground will keep sinking until the pumping beneath it is finally brought into balance, and that reckoning has merely been postponed, not resolved. The aqueduct is a patch on a wound the state keeps reopening, and no patch, however expensive, can hold if the wound is never allowed to close. In the end, the story of this great sinking aqueduct is a parable for how societies deal with slow, invisible, underground disasters. The damage happens out of sight, over decades, one well and one dry year at a time, until suddenly the bill comes due in the form of a strangled artery and a multi-billion-dollar repair. And even then, the temptation is to fix the visible thing. The concrete we can see and touch, rather than the harder, deeper cause hidden beneath the soil. 11 years is what the money buys, and 11 years is not nothing, but it is not a solution either. The real fix lies far below the aqueduct, in the exhausted aquifers of the Central Valley, in the hard, slow, contested work of finally taking less water out of the ground than the rains put back. Until California does that, it will keep pouring billions into the concrete, buying decade after borrowed decade, watching the land sink beneath its greatest river, and postponing, again and again, the one reckoning it cannot engineer its way around. The aqueduct will flow, the clock will reset, and somewhere beneath the fields of the San Joaquin Valley, quietly and permanently, the ground will keep on sinking,